What would you do if you saw your reflection blink back at you? That's the question that haunted Jonathan's mind as he stood before the ancient mask, unearthed from an archaeological dig half a world away. The mask was made of dark, weathered wood, intricately carved with symbols no one could decipher. Its hollow eyes seemed to watch him, waiting for something. He wasn't sure what drew him to it, perhaps the promise of power, or the sense that this artifact was different from anything he had ever seen. The rumors had been vague but tantalizing: immense strength, endless knowledge, control over one's enemies. But there was always a price. Jonathan had heard stories of those who tried it on before him, none of them ending well. The mask had a history, and those who wore it were never the same again. Yet, there it was in his hands, and the pull was undeniable. What harm could come from just trying it on, if only for a moment? He stared at his reflection, feeling the weight of the mask in his hands. His reflection flickered, a subtle movement, just for a second. His heart skipped a beat, but he brushed it off. It was just his imagination. The longer he hesitated, the more powerful the urge became. His fingers tingled as he lifted the mask toward his face, the wood cold against his skin. As he placed it over his head, the world around him grew silent, eerily still. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a whisper, a voice not his own, echoed in his mind, "You are mine now." His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke across his forehead. He wanted to tear the mask off, but his hands wouldn't move. It was as if something, or someone, else had taken control. His reflection in the mirror grinned wickedly, but Jonathan knew that wasn't him anymore. The moment Jonathan tried to scream, he realized he couldn't. His voice, his breath, everything felt trapped inside, like his soul had been sealed away. The mask was no longer an accessory but a part of him. The pressure built inside his chest, but no matter how hard he fought, nothing changed. His own reflection stared back at him with a grin too wide, too unnatural. It was his face, yet the eyes gleamed with malice. The voice in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "You wanted power, didn't you?" it hissed. "Now you'll have it, but at a price." Jonathan's vision flickered as his surroundings began to shift. His small apartment twisted and bent, the walls warping like melted wax, and shadows slithered across the floor. He wasn't alone anymore. There were others in the dark corners, faceless figures whispering his name, calling him deeper into the void. His heart raced, every instinct telling him to run, but his legs refused to move. The door behind him creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning as if protesting the movement. Jonathan's mind screamed at him to turn around, but his body followed its own accord, walking toward the now yawning blackness. Cold air rushed from the doorway, carrying with it the stench of decay. He swallowed hard, feeling his body tremble, but he couldn't stop himself. It was as if something beyond his control was pulling him forward, step by step, into the unknown. He crossed the threshold and found himself standing in a hallway he had never seen before. The walls were cracked, ancient, as if the place had been abandoned for centuries. Faint, distant laughter echoed from deeper inside. Jonathan's hands shook violently, but they weren't his anymore. The mask seemed to have taken over entirely, guiding him like a puppet on strings. At the end of the hallway, a door appeared, solid, dark wood, with deep claw marks scratched into the surface. His mind raced, panic setting in as the voice in his head continued to taunt him. "Do you see now? There's no going back. You belong to me." Jonathan fought to regain control, but his limbs moved without his permission, reaching for the handle and turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in dim light, a flickering bulb swaying overhead. In the center of the room, a figure sat hunched over, its face hidden beneath a hood. Jonathan's breath hitched as the figure slowly rose to its feet, towering over him. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the figure turned. It had no face, just a blank canvas of skin stretched across where features should have been. The only thing that stood out was the mask it wore, identical to the one now bonded to Jonathan's own face. The figure tilted its head, studying him, before the voice returned. "You're just the latest. There were others before you, and there will be more after." The masked figure lunged forward with unnatural speed, its blank face inches from Jonathan's. His body froze, terror gripping him as it leaned in closer, its cold breath brushing against his skin. "Soon, you'll understand what true power feels like," it whispered, before everything went black. Jonathan awoke in darkness, the cold, oppressive air pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, disoriented and confused. The room he had been in was gone. Now, he found himself in what looked like an ancient crypt, its walls lined with rows upon rows of skulls, each one grinning in eternal silence. The faint glow of candles cast eerie shadows, making the skulls appear to watch his every move. His hands instinctively reached for his face, but the mask was still there, fused to his skin. "Welcome to your new reality," the voice echoed in his mind. It was louder now, more commanding. "This is where you will remain, unless you embrace the power I offer." Jonathan's legs shook as he stumbled forward, his body no longer his own. He could feel the mask's presence within him, like a parasite feeding on his fear. The crypt stretched endlessly before him, its twisted halls spiraling deeper into the earth. Whispers filled the air, not just from the voice in his head but from the skulls themselves, each one muttering in languages long forgotten. As Jonathan ventured deeper into the crypt, he could feel his strength growing. His hands no longer trembled, and his steps became steadier. The mask, though still suffocating, seemed to be granting him control, at a cost. The more he gave in, the less he remembered who he truly was. The whispers, once incoherent, now started to make sense. They spoke of the mask's origins, of the souls it had devoured, each wearer left hollow, an empty shell of their former self. He stopped at a large, ornate door at the end of the corridor. Ancient symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly as he approached. The air grew heavy, almost electric, as if the door itself was alive, waiting for him. Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "Go on," the voice urged. "You want to know what lies beyond, don't you?" Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a grand chamber, vast and empty, save for a single pedestal in the center. Upon it rested a book, bound in what looked like human skin. The walls were adorned with paintings, grotesque depictions of men and women, all wearing the mask, their faces twisted in agony as they succumbed to its power. Jonathan's stomach churned as he realized the truth. The mask didn't just take control, it consumed, leaving nothing behind but madness. Approaching the pedestal, he reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed against it, a searing pain shot through his skull. His vision blurred, and the room began to spin. Suddenly, he was no longer in the crypt. He was standing in his apartment again, the familiar surroundings now warped and twisted. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. His reflection in the mirror stood motionless, even as he moved. It was him, but not him. The figure in the mirror began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. "You can't escape," the voice mocked. "You're mine, and soon, you'll be just like them." Jonathan's heart raced as the walls of his apartment seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. He could feel the mask tightening around his face, its grip unrelenting. He needed to find a way out, but every door he tried led him back to the same room, back to his reflection, back to the mask. No matter where he turned, there was no escape. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the silence. It was coming from the door at the far end of the hallway, the only door he hadn't tried. His hands trembled as he approached, each step heavier than the last. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. With a deep breath, he reached for the handle and pulled the door open. Standing before him was a man, gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his hollow eyes. He wore the same mask as Jonathan. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. "You think you're in control?" The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You're just the next in line. It won't be long before the mask consumes you completely." Jonathan stumbled back, panic setting in. The man stepped forward, his voice growing louder, more menacing. "There's no running from it. You'll become just like me, like all the others." The room spun again, and the masked man's face distorted, melting into the shadows. Jonathan could feel the mask tightening, pulling at his very soul. His vision blurred, and the world around him dissolved into darkness. The last thing he heard was the voice, laughing, as it whispered in his ear, "Soon, you'll understand what true power feels like." Jonathan's world was collapsing. The line between reality and nightmare blurred as the mask took deeper control. Each breath felt like a struggle, each thought no longer his own. He tried to remember who he was, but every time he did, the mask tightened its grip, suffocating any sense of self. He found himself wandering through endless corridors, the walls closing in around him. Faces from his past flickered in and out of focus, distorted and twisted, as if mocking him for his choices. The masked man's words echoed in his mind, taunting him. "You're just the next in line." Jonathan didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew the truth. The mask had consumed others before him, and he was no different. His only hope now was to find a way out before he lost himself completely. But every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the labyrinth of his own mind. The crypt, the apartment, the endless hallways, they were all connected, part of a twisted game the mask was playing with him. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The voice in his head grew louder, more insistent, demanding his submission. "Give in," it whispered. "Let me take control." Jonathan fought back with everything he had, but his resistance was weakening. The mask wasn't just controlling his body, it was consuming his soul, piece by piece. Suddenly, a door appeared at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, this one was different, smaller, less imposing. It looked almost ordinary, like the door to a bedroom in a suburban home. Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Something about this door felt familiar, like a memory buried deep within his mind. He opened it cautiously, stepping into a dimly lit room. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, filled the room. A single window, cracked and smeared with dirt, allowed a sliver of moonlight to filter in. At the center of the room stood a full-length mirror, its surface dull and clouded. Jonathan's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his own. It was the same twisted version he had seen before, the grin too wide, the eyes too dark. As he approached the mirror, the reflection began to move on its own, stepping closer until it pressed its hand against the glass. Jonathan instinctively reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. For a moment, it felt like nothing more than a mirror. But then, the glass rippled like water, and his reflection's hand passed through, grabbing hold of his wrist with an iron grip. Jonathan gasped, trying to pull away, but it was too late. The reflection yanked him forward, dragging him into the mirror. He fell through the glass as if it were liquid, tumbling into an abyss of darkness. The coldness was suffocating, and the sound of his heartbeat echoed in his ears, growing louder with each passing second. When he finally landed, it was on a hard, stone floor. He looked around, disoriented, and realized he was no longer in the room. The crypt had returned, but this time, it was different. The walls were alive, pulsating like they had a heartbeat of their own. Shadows slithered across the floor, moving with purpose, as if they were hunting him. Jonathan scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, but his body felt heavy, sluggish. The mask had tightened its hold, and with every passing moment, he could feel himself slipping further away. "Do you see now?" the voice in his head growled. "There is no escape. You are mine." Desperation clawed at Jonathan's mind. He couldn't let it end like this. He had to fight back, had to find a way to break free. But how? Every attempt to regain control only seemed to strengthen the mask's hold. The shadows grew closer, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. They wanted something from him, but he didn't know what. Suddenly, a memory flashed before his eyes. The book, the one he had found on the pedestal, bound in human skin. There had been something written on its pages, something he had overlooked in his panic. It was the key. It had to be. But where was it? He had left it behind in the other room. Or had he? The world around him twisted again, the crypt melting away, replaced by the apartment once more. The book was there, sitting on the coffee table, as if waiting for him. Jonathan lunged for it, flipping it open to the first page. The words were written in a language he didn't understand, but the symbols, they matched the ones on the mask. His hands trembled as he traced the symbols with his fingers. The moment his skin touched the page, the room darkened, and the shadows in the corners began to move. They crept closer, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The mask wasn't just feeding on him, it was calling to something else. Something darker. Something far more dangerous. The room shook violently, and the shadows surged forward, engulfing him in darkness. Jonathan screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the void. The mask tightened one final time, and then, silence. The shadows dissipated, and the room returned to normal. Jonathan stood in the center, the book still in his hands, but something was different. The mask was gone, its presence no longer felt. For the first time since he had put it on, he felt free. But as he looked down at the book, a chill ran down his spine. The symbols had changed. They now spelled out a single, haunting phrase, "It's only just begun." Jonathan's relief was short-lived. Though the mask was gone from his face, its presence lingered in the air like a shadow that wouldn't fade. The apartment felt unnervingly still, but something inside him had shifted. He closed the book, the chilling phrase still fresh in his mind, "It's only just begun." As he moved toward the door, the world outside the window seemed different. The streetlights flickered erratically, and the once familiar buildings appeared warped, their angles wrong, like a distorted version of reality. He knew he wasn't free, not really. The mask might have released him for now, but its grip still clung to his soul. Jonathan stepped outside, hoping the cool night air might help clear his head, but as soon as his foot hit the sidewalk, he felt eyes on him. Not just one pair, many. He glanced around but saw no one, just the empty street. Yet, the sensation persisted, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The world felt off. Every sound, every movement, carried a sinister edge. The trees rustled in the breeze, but the sound was wrong, as if they were whispering secrets. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching out in ways they shouldn't. Jonathan's pulse quickened, panic bubbling beneath the surface. He needed to keep moving, to put distance between himself and whatever unseen force was watching him. But as he turned the corner, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Across the street, in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, stood a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows. Jonathan's heart sank. The figure wore the mask, the same mask that had once been on his own face. "Not again," Jonathan whispered, taking a step back. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping into the light. The mask's empty eyes stared back at him, and for a brief moment, Jonathan swore he saw his own reflection in its polished surface. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. "You thought you could escape," it whispered, the voice crawling under his skin. "But there is no escape." Jonathan's legs trembled, his body urging him to run. But where could he go? The streets were deserted, and even if he managed to flee, what then? The mask's influence wasn't bound by physical distance. It was inside him, a part of him. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around for any sign of safety. There was none. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest, causing him to double over in agony. He clutched at his chest, gasping for breath, but the pain only intensified. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he could hear the faint sound of laughter, cold, cruel, and distant. The mask's voice returned, stronger now, more insidious. "You can't outrun your fate, Jonathan. You belong to me." With each passing second, the world around him seemed to unravel. The streetlights flickered and dimmed until they went out entirely, leaving him in total darkness. Jonathan fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His thoughts were a whirlwind of terror and confusion, but one thing was clear: the mask hadn't let him go. It had merely toyed with him, allowing him a brief taste of freedom before dragging him back into the abyss. In the darkness, the figure appeared again, this time much closer. Jonathan's heart raced as he felt the presence looming over him. The masked figure knelt down, its face inches from his own. "You should have known," it whispered. "Once you put it on, it's forever." The figure reached out, placing its cold hand on Jonathan's face, and for a moment, everything stopped. The world fell silent, and the pain subsided. But when Jonathan opened his eyes, he wasn't on the street anymore. He was back in the crypt, the walls lined with skulls, the air thick with decay. The masked figure stood before him, its posture unnaturally still, like a statue. Jonathan's heart sank as the truth became clear. The crypt, the masked figure, the whispers in the shadows, they had always been part of the mask's world. And now, so was he. The figure reached for its mask, slowly lifting it off its face. But beneath the mask, there was nothing. Just darkness. An endless, consuming void. As the figure extended the mask toward Jonathan, he realized what was happening. He wasn't the next wearer. He was the next victim. "You will wear it," the voice said, cold and final. "And once you do, there's no turning back." The mask hovered before him, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Jonathan tried to scream, tried to resist, but his body betrayed him. His hands reached out, trembling, as they took hold of the mask once more. As he placed it over his face, the world faded into darkness. The last thing he saw before the mask claimed him completely was his own reflection, grinning, twisted, and no longer his own. And then, there was silence.